Alright, so this is on Chapter 12, Two-Dimensional Imaging. If you previously tried to watch the video that was on YouTube, I apologize, it didn't have any audio. We're going to try to redo this now. So this chapter on two-dimensional imaging is important because it's going to take a lot of the concepts that we've been learning about. In fact, most of what we've been learning to this point has just been memorization of different disparate factoids about ultrasound machines. And this chapter is going to take those, bring them together, and hopefully start making some sense of what exactly an ultrasound image, how it's created and what it does. So before I actually get into some of the content of the chapter, I want to go over how we make an ultrasound image. The image is made by taking a pulse, sending it into the body, getting echoes back from it. That creates the A-mode picture that we, or A-mode display that we saw in Chapter 11. That A-mode display, those peaks are what are used to determine the brightness along each scan line. And then we take those scan lines, those A-modes if you would, and we put them one after the other across the screen and form an image with them. So we do this we send out pulses about 3,000 times a second. We create images about 30 times a second, or 15 to 30 times a second. So it's all done very quickly, and that's how we make our two-dimensional images. Let's just briefly go over the transducer. When we're concerned about making a picture, we're concerned about the shape of the transducer, because that's going to have a lot to do with determining the shape of the image, and the number of active elements is also going to have a lot to do with determining how that image is created, how long it takes it to create. So and we'll go over towards the end of this how different transducers relate to different types of images. But I just want you to know that that's important for us to know the shape of the transducer and the type of elements that it has in it. All transducers we use today are what we call phased array transducers. Any transducer other than a phased array transducer probably would be a single crystal transducer that we used to use, a mechanical transducer. With phased array transducers, so getting back to the ones that we use today, the image is created by small timing delays going to the little subcrystals in the transducer head. Alright, so each timing delay, we'll talk more about how those work in a few minutes, but those timing delays direct our beam and shape our beam when we're going to be scanning in somebody. So they focus the sound beams, they create the shape of the image, and with that we have to know what's going to happen when an element, what we call an active element, one of those microcrystals, is broken in our transducer. So we'll learn about those things as we go through this chapter. So let's talk about the mechanical transducers, the old ones that used a single crystal. So when we're talking about a single crystal transducer, this is what we're referring to. These transducers have a single round element that is physically moved to different positions in order to make the scan lines. This is called a single element transducer or single crystal transducer. The image that this one's going to make is going to be a sector shape because it's turning in a radius. And so the pulses radiate outward from it as it's spinning and make pictures. Okay, send out signals, get echoes back, and we make pictures with it. Okay, now remember, because it is like a spoke of a wheel, as it gets farther from the transducer face, there becomes a gap, a bigger gap when the pulse is between scan lines. Okay, so if we were to take this out to an extreme, say 10 feet, you might have a 1 foot gap between your scan lines, which would tell you that you're missing a lot of information because of the way it rotates through the area. However, close to the transducer face, there's very little gap, so we get good imaging in the near field because of that. So with mechanical transducers, the beam steering is all done by movement of the crystal. So if we move the crystal, that's how we get steering. Focusing is fixed with these. The manufacturer will set it where the focus should be. It can't be changed. So this is what we call conventional, mechanical, or fixed focusing. We can't adjust it. It's set by the manufacturer, and it doesn't change. So in those respects, it's fairly easy. So there's several methods of beam focusing that the manufacturer can use in order to set the focus of the transducer. One is internal focusing, they call it. This is where they literally shape the crystal itself so that it focuses the beam where they want it. Another is using external focusing, and this is the use of a acoustic lens that they place over the crystal to focus the sound beam. So it's just like a light lens, and it will focus the beam down. The other thing they could use is an acoustic mirror. That's a obsolete method that's not used anymore, but it does the same thing. It's like focusing light with a parabolic mirror, and it works. But mirrors are obsolete, acoustic lenses are obsolete, and quite frankly, mechanical transducers are obsolete, so we won't worry too much about that. The focusing takes place in both the lateral plane, lateral viewing, and in the elevational plane, because it is a round crystal. So because it's a round crystal, you've got sound is focused in both directions. So with mechanical transducers, it's important to know that if the PZT crystal is damaged, the entire image is lost. It should make sense. There's one crystal, and so if that crystal gets broken, you're not going to get an image. Mechanical transducers, though they were relatively cheap to make and fairly simple to make because they had one crystal, they have many moving parts to them because of having to actually move the transducer and steer it, and they tended to break fairly often. So that unfortunately led to the fact that these just didn't work as well as we wanted them to. They tended to break down. Having said that, as you know, I've got the machine and the storage there that we use, and it's from 1982 and still works. So sometimes, I guess, if you take care of them, they can still work very well. So I've got one mechanical transducer that does work and one that is broken, but it's interesting that it still works. So transducer arrays, what we use today, phased array transducers, are made with arrays of crystals. And when I say an array of crystal, we take a bunch of crystals and line them up in a row, and we call that a linear array. So the way they make these is they take a single slab of PZT material and they just literally cut it with a very fine saw into small elements, or even, I don't know if they use a laser. I was told they use actually a mechanical saw to cut these with. There is a transducer factory over in Tempe that makes transducers for GE. You can look them up and go visit them and see exactly how these are made if you're interested. So each sub-element is connected by its own electrical connection, and during phasing, or during pulsing, the beamformer, or what's also known as the pulsar, sends signals to individual subcrystals or groups of subcrystals at a time. So it sends its own signal to them. During reception, when the echoes are coming back from the body, and the echoes stimulate the piezoelectric subcrystals, those signals come back individually back to the system, to the receiver. So during reception, each individual crystal produces its own electrical signal. The different types of array transducers, the one we're most familiar with is a linear array, and this is just a flat crystal that has a bunch of subcrystals in it. I'm going to kind of draw a picture of a linear array crystal so you can see what that would look like. So if we're looking at it from on the face, it just looks like this. Oops, wrong. Don't want that one. With a bunch of cuts in it that are the subcrystals. Okay. And then if we go back and we look at the convex or curvilinear, that's the same sort of thing, but this is looking at it from the face. If we look at our linear array from the side, we have the handle and then a flat top on it. With a curvilinear, from the face it would look very similar. You know, you'd have little subcrystals. But on the side it would have a curved top. And this is what you should be familiar with from using in the lab for abdomen scanning. Something like that, where the array of crystals is across the top here. And with this one, the array of crystals is across the top here. So we have the linear array on the left and the curvilinear array on the right. And then there's another type of transducer called the annular array, and I think you're only learning about this because Edelman's book covers it. And honestly, I think Edelman is the last person on Earth that has covered annular array probes, because I believe when he was doing his physics dissertation, this is what he worked on. But an annular array probe has, instead of a line of crystals one after the other in a row like we saw before, so I'll go back and draw. This is what the linear array was that I'm filling in now. An annular array is much more like an onion. It's kind of this big circular. Each element is a circle, one larger than the other. So that's what an annular array probe looked like. And it worked just like a mechanical array in that it had to be, it would be from the side, you would have the casing that holds it, and then you'd have this flat crystal in here that was made up of many circles of it, and then it had to be directed somehow through a mechanical means. That's supposed to be a gear that would wobble this thing back and forth, so that if it was pointed towards the left, then it would send out a beam to the left. If it was pointed straight down, it would send it forward. And if you pointed it over to the right, then you could get a beam to go off to the right. So it had to be, this whole thing had to be rotated back and forth in order to make it work. But it did have the advantage that you, as you can see, you could use either a small section of it for near field imaging with a small diameter, or a large amount of the crystal for deep imaging, having a big deep diameter. So that's how the annular array probe worked. Like I say, these are obsolete. We don't use them anymore, and I think Edelman's the only one that still is talking about them at all. But we'll go over them because he does talk about them. We'll go over them. All right, so linear phased array transducers. These are also known as sector or vector phased array transducers. They give us this pie shape. That's where it gets its name, sector. There's a company, Acuson, said, ooh, we'll call that a vector shape. Whatever. You can call it vector, sector, whatever you want. It's pie shaped. It's a small phase footprint transducer, so the actual face of it is very small. And the crystals are running across it in a linear fashion, has no moving parts, and the beam is steered in focus using phasing. So it is purely electronic, no moving parts. It's really nice for that. So with electronic steering, little wavelets are formed, which formed by sending out pulses in the subcrystals, and each pulse that goes to each subcrystal is delayed slightly, and that forms a wavefront using because of Huygens principle. And wavefronts move perpendicular to their face. Okay, so let's kind of draw this out real quick and what we're talking about. If we have a linear array crystal, okay, which we've been drawing now several times, so you should get used to this. And you'll know that my lines are never the same. If we stimulate the crystal, and this little thing here represents a voltage that's stimulating the crystal, what we'll get is we will get a wavefront, a wavelet that will come off of this small little transducer here, this little microcrystal here. Then a small amount of time later, we'll send out one from this one, and the length of this line here represents the amount of time it takes for the voltage to get to the microcrystal. So this one is a short amount of time, this one's slightly longer. So these amounts of time that we're sending out voltages to it. So this one then is now stimulated, and because it's now stimulated, this one is actually now propagating outward. Okay, so it's propagating outward, and then a little bit later in time we're going to set off the next one, right? And then this one propagates a little farther out, and then this one propagates even farther out. Okay, and we're going to continue doing that with time delays on these crystals until we have several little micro wavelets that have come out and then propagated and then continued to propagate and then continued even more, and these will start adding up, and they will eventually form a wave front along here. So this wave front will form from these little microcrystals, and that wavefront will move perpendicular to its face. Okay, so this is how we get the beam to move in different directions. We utilize small little wavelets that come together utilizing Huygens principle, and those wavelets will then form a wavefront, and it's all due to the delays from the timing that occurred when we sent the pulses outward. And those delays, these little timing delays that you see here, are called phasing. So phasing occurs and we get a wavefront that is created utilizing Huygens principle, and that steers our wave in a direction. We can do the same thing with focusing of the beam. We can focus it just like we could steer it. And it's just, again, it's done with phasing, and the phasing occurs with time delays in the signal that's sent from the pulsar or beamformer to the transducer. And in this case, if we're focusing it, we can send out a pulse. Here we're going to send out one on each end of this, and then a little bit later we're going to send out a pulse a little closer in, and then a little later we'll send out another pulse. And so these are propagating outward, this is propagating outward, and we just continue doing that with our pulses until we get this convex shape to our beam. And the wavefront, again, when you think of the wavefront, it is now shaped convexly, and as I said, it moves perpendicular to itself, so it's moving in this direction here, moving this direction here, and moving this direction here. And you can see that those are all converging on some point that is going to become the focus. And if you look at these timing delays, that tells you exactly how the beam will be focused when it's created. Okay? And then this focus is going to come down to a point, and after the focus it'll diverge outward. So we can use this technique of phasing to do both focusing and steering of the beam. And we can do both at the same time also. So we'd have just a slightly different shape to the timing pattern, and it would focus and steer the beam. So it's kind of cool. Kind of neat the way that works. So with linear phase systems, either the sector, vector, or any other kind of phased array system, when the crystals are damaged, because there's often 500 crystals across the face of a small transducer, you do lose some signal, but it's very unpredictable what's going to happen. It can either be a small amount of loss of signal and the image may appear completely normal. There might be some distortion seen, or it may end up that the image is completely unusable. So we don't really know what's going to happen with the damage, but the damage does add up, and eventually those transducers do become unusable. Phased array transducers are always adjustable. They're steerable and multi-focus. So let me rephrase that. If a transducer has the capability of being multi-focus, steerable, or adjustable image, then it is a phased array transducer. That's one way you can tell that these are phased array, is that they're steerable and they have multiple foci, or you can move the foci. Linear array transducers are phased array transducers, but we call them linear array just because the crystals are lined up in a row. Okay. So how does the phasing work? Again, the electric signals arrive at elements, and if they all arrive at the same time, the wavefront will move directly away from the transducer. When electrical signals arrive with slight time delays between them, then that can cause the wave to form an angle or a focus because of what I've already described. So that is how the phasing works. So we'll just take another second here to discuss this phasing idea and signals reach the transducer at slightly different times. The sound wavelets propagate, and then Huygens effect, Huygens principle, forms a beam front, and the beam front then moves perpendicular to its face. So pretty simple actually. With focusing, the signal arrives, the wavefronts move forward, they form a convex. So the convex wavefront forms and moves perpendicular to itself into a focus point. With the concept of beam steering, it is very similar to what, oops, this needs to come down a little bit here. It's very similar to focusing in that, but we tend to have a little bit of shape to the, so that it's not completely convex. It would instead be, oops, something happened there. There we go. It would instead be off-centered, so that it is more of a short shape like that. So this, in this case, the beam that is created by this firing pattern would be steered in this direction and slightly focused at some point closer than the natural focus. Okay, and so I'm not going to draw the wavelets on this because the firing pattern tells you exactly what the shape of the wavelets are going to be. And this is a standardized technique, these firing patterns, across ultrasound, so that if you see this on the SPI exam, you will recognize it. So that's focusing and steering. And then there's one more concept I want to discuss about this, and that's, sometimes you'll hear about the defocused beam, and that's what they're trying to say, something like this, in that if we fired it off in the center first and then made a concave, I don't know, convex, concave, whatever, this kind of firing pattern, you see, this is not focused. This is already diffusing, or not diffusing, what's the word I'm looking for? Diverging as soon as it comes off of the beam. And this will not work. You can't get any kind of an image at all with this. So if you see this, this is not going to work. This is what they call a defocused timing pattern, and it does not work. It does not exist in the real world. Okay. So phased array beam steering comes down to two things, actually three things, but two things, and that is a slope. The electronic pattern will have a slope to it. That indicates that it's steering the sound beam. Or it will have a curve to it, which will indicate that it's focusing, or it'll have a combination of the two, indicating that it'll be steering and focusing. So Dr. Edelman wants to introduce us to something called dynamic receive focusing. And dynamic receive focusing is just, let's read through this. It'll sum it up for us just slightly. Each echo that comes back to the transducer reaches different parts of the crystal at different times. Dynamic receive focusing is just simply an electronic delay that the manufacturers use to refocus the signal in the receiver. And this is done continuously. It's done at all depths, and all you need to know is it's done by magic. You don't need to know how it's done. If you really want to know how it's done, there's a article by Dr. Kremkow in the Journal of Diagnostic Medical Sonography that it's called The Changing Paradigm of Ultrasound. It goes through this entire dynamic receive focusing thing. Believe me, all you need to know is it's magic. It's done by the manufacturer, but the points you do need to know: it's called dynamic receive focusing, and it's done continuously, and it's done at all depths. Okay, and unlike transmit focusing, receive focusing does not slow down our temporal resolution. All right, so I am going to take a second to kind of draw out what's going on with dynamic receive focusing, just so you have a little bit of an understanding of it. So if we have a transducer and a lot of microcrystals on it, if there's a reflector in the body, say right here, and our beam is sent out and comes to it, well, it's going to send back a reflection, right? That should make sense. Those are terrible. Okay, there we go. That's a little better. Now, this path back to this part of the crystal here is slightly shorter than the path back to the crystal over here. Okay, so it should make sense to you that it takes less time to get here and stimulate the microcrystal and send it back to the machine than it does over here. It takes longer for the signal to get there. And all dynamic receive focusing is it's taking these two signals that arrive at different times and saying, oh hey, because I'm smart, I know that this is the machine talking, not me. I know that this echo came from that point right there. I can use both of these signals together, combine them to get a clearer picture. Okay? And that's what we're going to call, let's make that smaller, dynamic receive focusing. Okay? Or D receive F, DERF. And DERF is magic. Okay, that's all you really need to know. Alright, so let's talk about our different transducers that we have that we're going to work with. Okay, so I said we'd go back in and talk about the annular array transducer. This is a electronically focused transducer, and all that means is that we can select however many of these diameters of annular circles we want to fire off at a time. It's electronically focused but mechanically steered, and again, it's obsolete, nobody uses it. So in this, the elevational plane is focused at the same time as the lateral plane, and if the crystal is damaged, a band artifact is created. And what a band artifact is that I'm going to have to draw a little picture on the screen here because I don't have this. Let's see, pen. Let's make it black. And we're going to try to make that. Yeah, that's all we can do. Okay, so because we're bringing up annular array transducers, I mentioned this point here that the elevational plane is focused the same as the lateral plane, and then this damage causes a band artifact. On the SPI exam, these are the only two possible questions they're going to ask you about annular array transducers. And hopefully they won't be on there. They weren't on mine when I took it last time, but they potentially could. So elevational plane is focusing, in an annular array. And a band artifact is when you have a section of the image across the middle of it that is just simply missing information. Okay, it forms a band across the picture, so you get this missing band of information. And that's what will happen if a crystal, one of these rings of the crystal here, oops, I can't draw that. That's what's happened if one of those is broken. You get one ring of this broken, and it'll cause a band artifact. Those are your two questions for the SPI. All right, linear sequential array transducers. Okay, now this is where Dr. Edelman makes a big mistake, or a mistake. He calls this the one on the bottom right. He calls that a linear sequential array transducer, and it's not. It's just a regular linear array transducer. The one on the top right is a sequential array transducer. The bottom one is phased. It uses time delays. The top one does not use time delays. It fires off a group of crystals moving across the face of this thing one at a time until it has fired all of them off. Phasing, again, as we said, uses wavelets and Huygens principle and steers and angles and focuses and all that. This thing sent them off straight. Okay, so a sequential array transducer just sends them straight. A phased array sends them in multiple directions. This is your sequential array. This is the kind of picture you would get with a sequential array transducer, and you can see that it is causing these lines going all the way down the image because each group of the transducer is just going straight. And so this is what we used to see when we use these things to do, and this one that's shown here is actually a obstetrics transducer, and so you can see the baby head here. This is a phased array transducer. Phased array transducers can angle the beam. You can see the beam is angled here and the color is angled a little bit. If it has color, it's a phased array. If it has Doppler, it's phased array. These are modern day transducers, and we call them phased array transducers. This one we would call a linear phased array transducer just because the top of it is flat. And as I said before, the curvilinear is a curved transducer. So you see the curvilinear up here. So linear array, curvilinear array. This is a phased array sector transducer. The beam comes out in a sector shape. This is a phased array and something called a 1.5 dimensional array transducer, and I'm going to get into what that is in just a second here. But again, it's a sector array transducer. This is a two-dimensional array transducer that's forming a sector. So let's go into what this 1.5 dimensional array transducer is, because that seems important to some people. Alright, so a regular flat linear array transducer just consists of a flat thing that's been cut into subcrystals, right? You may have heard this before. There we go. That's called a one-dimensional array transducer because the crystals are in here in a row in one dimension, one right after the other. Okay. A 1.5 dimensional array transducer is essentially the same thing. It's cut this way, but then they go in and they make a couple extra cuts to it, and they'll, oops, that's not a good one. Let's do a better drop. There we go. Okay, so they'll cut little smaller crystals front and back. Okay, so let's take a look at this thing up top here from the side. Okay? From the side it looks like that. All right? It's a single crystal, and it may have a little bit of shape to it this way, where the manufacturer has curved it in order to shape the beam in the elevational plane. Okay, let me do that better. There we go. Now, this one, if you look at it from the side, okay, and I'll just redraw the sides here so that when I'm talking about the side, I'm talking about, so here's a little ortho. You've got your cord coming into the back of it here, and so this is the side, and if we look at that side, this is what we see on the one-dimensional. On the two-dimensional, or the 1.5 dimensional array probe, when we look at it from the side, what we see is a transducer that has these cuts in it like this. So it's actually a linear array transducer in the side too. And we can do the same thing with this. We can fire off this first, this later, maybe this first. And now we can steer, we get the same effect. The wavelets come out and they're focused there we go. They're focused in the elevational plane. So now we're getting a elevational focused image. So it not only focuses in the lateral plane this way, but it focuses in the elevational plane. Alright, so that's a 1.5 dimensional array probe. That's got to be the worst one ever made. There you go. 1.5 dimensional array. Okay. Now, a two-dimensional array probe is very similar, except that it is a bunch of microcrystals cut in both directions equally amounts, by equal amounts. And so when this one is utilized in a probe, it has the capability of focusing equally in both the lateral dimension and the elevational dimension. And in fact, Philips makes a probe like this. This is a 2D probe. Philips makes a probe called the matrix probe, and it is capable of imaging longitudinally and transversely all at the same time. It's really kind of cool. I want one, but they're about $40,000, so I'll wait for a while. So anyhow, these two-dimensional probes are capable of doing both elevation and lateral focusing equally. And they're also used for volume imaging, and we'll talk about that in just a little bit. Alright, so let's move back to our imaging. Alright, so let's look at what happens when some of our fancy little phase array transducers break on us, when the crystal elements get destroyed because somebody dropped them. So this one on the left is showing you some small dropouts. It's not too bad. You could probably still use it for most of your imaging. However, the one on the right, this curvilinear on the right, you're seeing multiple dead elements in it that are showing you that will affect your image. Okay, so if your anatomy is directly below these areas that are no good, then you're not going to get a good image with it. So that's kind of how they break. So convex, curved, or curvilinear array transducers are these transducers that we typically are using for scanning abdomens and endocavity work. These always have a curved face and generally a curved far field. The crystal array is arranged along a curved surface. This gives us not the narrowest footprint, but a narrower footprint in the near field, and a wide footprint in the far field. Okay, so if they described this image as having a wider far field than near field, this could be what they're talking about. Beam steering on these is generally done by just firing them out straight. The curve itself will take care of the steering. You just select a different group as you go across. However, there is some beam steering that is being done. So there is some beam steering with these. There is some phasing that's occurring. But there is definitely electronic focusing that's happening. And so that's usually your clue on these, whether or not it's a mechanical or phased array, is that there's focusing going on, and that's always occurring with phased array transducers. So image shape, arc top, arc bottom must be curvilinear. Vector arrays, same as a phased array. These can be also steered. In fact, they are steered. Vector arrays are steered in order to image off at the side. So remember, these are causing a sector shape image. Let's see if we can do that. There we go. A sector shaped image. And so in order to steer the beam this way, you must have phase steering. In order to come back in another direction, you also must have phase steering. So a little flat transducer is able to do both directions. So this is a phased array transducer. Our general rule of thumb, if it can be steered, it's phased array. If the shape at the top is not identical to the shape at the bottom, then it is phased array. If it has color or Doppler, it's phased array. And if you're using it and it's after 1990, it's phased array. I know of nobody that has used one since 1990 that was not a phased array transducer. This is showing you what the elevational resolution of a transducer is. We've talked a little bit about that with annular array probes, but the elevational resolution is the slice thickness. So you've got your X and Y, your axial resolution, your lateral resolution, which would be X and Y, and then elevational would be Z, up and down, thickness of the slice plane. So we always make this assumption that the imaging plane is very thin, but that's not always true. Because there is some thickness to the slices, the structures in front of or behind the imaging plane may be incorporated into the picture with what we're looking at. So that sometimes can happen. Let me draw another picture to kind of describe what I'm referring to as that. So if we have our curvilinear array transducer here, there, and if we turn it 90 degrees, okay, then we look at it from the side, it looks like that. And so our elevational plane is this focus along here, okay? And we would like it to be perfectly thin, but if you can imagine a situation, let's say you've got a gallbladder here, okay, that's getting picked up by the beam, and then you've got bowel gas also right adjacent to it. Well, at some point in this picture right in here, the bowel gas and the gallbladder are getting blended together, okay? So you're seeing both of them at the same time in the picture, even though you only wanted to see one. So that is what we mean by slice thickness. Now let's make that slice bigger so that it really There you go. So this part here is all coming together all at once. Okay. And that's what an elevational resolution is. So one-dimensional phased array probes have a fixed focus in the elevational plane. The manufacturer sets it, nothing we can do with it. The multi-dimensional array probes, such as the 1.5 dimensional array, allows some focusing in that elevational plane. So this is a one-dimensional array probe. It is allowing focusing in the elevational plane, as I showed before, by firing off the outer ones first and then the center one second, and then that will allow us to focus a little shallower in the elevational plane. Two-dimensional array probes also allow full focusing in both elevational and lateral dimensions. So a two-dimensional array probe will allow that to occur. Here is a picture of a two-dimensional array probe face. That's a human hair laying across it, so you can imagine how small these little segments are that are going to create it, and that they look like are little posts of piezoelectric material set in resin, and that's how they make these things. And it's very delicate work to make these. That's why the probes are so darned expensive. So now, the last thing we're going to introduce in this chapter is three-dimensional imaging, which is, I find, quite ironic for a chapter called two-dimensional imaging. But with a two-dimensional array probe, we can do three-dimensional imaging. Okay, so I said that these probes, GE makes one called the matrix probe that's capable of capturing both longitudinal and transverse images at the same time, and that's exactly what's going on with these three-dimensional imaging. You're taking a series of two-dimensional images, putting them together, and making a image out of them, or a volume out of them. So the technique that gives you the picture of the baby faces, if you will, is called rendering. Okay, so when we look at the three-dimensional information, and I'm going to pause a second here. Okay, so as we look at one of these 3D pictures of a baby that's on there, the technique that makes it look three-dimensional is called rendering. And you know, this image is not a three-dimensional picture. It is a two-dimensional picture. If you get up and go to the side of your screen, you'll see that it is flat, just like the rest of the screen across here, but it gives this illusion of three dimensions. And the technique to give that illusion is what was developed for a movie called Toy Story, called rendering. And this is a post-processing technique to take three-dimensional information, and in Woody's case here, they took this wireframe of information and rendered him into what looks like a three-dimensional character. Well, we do the same with the baby faces, as we take the three-dimensional information and render it with our machines into looking like a three-dimensional picture. Okay, so rendering is a post-processing technique to display 3D information. So that's enough 3D. We're going to move on now to another subject. And this is called side lobe artifacts. So side lobes are sound beams that come off of mechanical single crystal array transducers that are being moved. This is energy. You can see the side lobe up in this area in the, oops, sorry. This will be the side lobe. I'll show it to you as it comes off. See that energy coming off right there? That's the side lobe. And that's going to cause artifacts if you have a reflector out in that area. So let's say we've got a reflector. Oh, wrong color. Got to pick a better ink color here. There we go. Okay, so we have this strong reflector right there. That side lobe's gonna bounce off and strike the transducer. Okay. Well, what the machine is gonna think is it's gonna say, oh, I sent out that information this direction. That reflector must be right there, because that's the way my main beam is going. And so it'll take the reflector, which is up here on the left, and put it right smack dab in the center of your screen. Okay, that's called a lateral displacement error, and it's going to affect what you see on the image. It degrades lateral resolution because it's taking something that's out here and putting it right in the middle of the screen, and it's just a bad thing to have happen. So, but side lobe artifacts occur. And like I said, they are unique to single crystal moving transducers. So they do occur in our phased array transducers, and those they call grating lobes. Why not just call them side lobes? I don't know. Must have something to do with how they're made. Doesn't matter. So grating lobes are just simply artifacts that are exactly like side lobe artifacts, except they occur with multi-element array probes. So there you go. There's something else to learn. A grating lobe is just like a side lobe, except grating lobes occur with multi-element array probes. Side lobes occur with single crystal transducers. Now, there are some techniques we have to reduce grating lobes in transducers, and those techniques are one's called apodization. Apodization is when the actual voltage strength excuse me, the voltages are of different strengths, different amounts going to the microcrystals. So this little microcrystal might get a lower voltage hitting it than the one right next to it. And this one might get a different lower, higher voltage hitting it. And so even though we're phasing our sound into these, we're also now varying our voltages. This variation of voltages is called apodization. Apodization reduces grating lobes. What is apodization? It's a technique of varying voltages to reduce grating lobes. Okay? How can you reduce grating lobes? Two ways: apodization and subdicing. Okay, so what is subdicing? Subdicing is taking our little micro elements that we already have cut, and we took our array of crystal, we've cut it into sub-elements, and now subdicing is making little partial cuts into those sub-elements that don't quite go all the way through. Now, in this picture, all the cuts are equal depth. In reality, subdicing cuts them to different depths. So, subdicing is a technique of partial thickness cuts in crystal elements to reduce grating lobes. Okay, so now, how do we reduce grating lobes? By apodization and subdicing. Alright, so now the easy part. This is the format you get with a curvilinear array, or what we call a curvilinear array probe. Okay, in this case, this is an endovaginal probe looking at a uterus. You can see a small yolk sac right here within a gestational sac. This is a nice image made with a curvilinear array probe, specifically an endovaginal probe. This is a curvilinear array probe that is taking a picture transabdominally of a fetus, and we can see the fetal bones of the skull, the fetal palate, the nasal bones, chin. So this is a curvilinear image format. The top is curved, the bottom is curved. It's a curvilinear. This is a sector format. The bottom may be curved, but it comes to either a point or a flat area. This forms a sector, and it's also known as a vector format. So sector or vector, same thing. This just happens to be a cardiac image. This is a linear array probe, and this is the linear array picture that you would typically see with this grayscale in the background, and then in the foreground you see color put on it, and so this is your color Doppler. And you see these angles on the side of the color box here and here. That tells you that this colored box was steered. Okay, so that was an actual steered image. This image actually consists of two images overlaid on top of each other, a grayscale and a color image. And we actually would call this a duplex ultrasound because the color and the grayscale are made with two different techniques. That's a duplex image. Okay. Though in general, duplex is usually referring to just a grayscale image with Doppler information on a different section of the screen. In this case, the Doppler information is overlaid on top of the grayscale, but it's still a duplex. And the important thing is this is a phased array transducer. Okay. And now let's talk about one more subject before we're done for the chapter, and that's something called a dynamic aperture. And a dynamic aperture is the ability of the manufacturer to change the size of the number of crystals, I should say, or the size of the initial beam width. Okay. So the system changes the number of elements used to transmit and receive reflections. This is known as variable aperture or dynamic aperture. It's done to improve lateral resolution, and they can do it very quickly over many depths. So dynamic aperture is the ability to change the number of elements used to transmit pulses and receive reflections, and it improves lateral resolution. That's what you need to know. Other names for dynamic aperture are variable aperture. All right, so that concludes our chapter 12. And I apologize if you tried to listen to the other presentation of it, but we'll try to do better next time. I don't know what happened to the machine. All right, take care. Bye.